Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining. We'll just give it a couple more minutes, allow a few more people to join, and then we'll get started with the webinar. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much everybody for joining today and for joining so promptly. It's much appreciated. For those of you that don't know us, we are Sepio Research. We're a full service market research agency, and we help PR marketing agencies and brands with their research and insight needs. I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce you to the team from Sepio Research that you'll be hearing from today. My name is Harriet, and I am Research Director here at Sepio. I'll be joined by Andrew, our CEO and co-founder, and by Catherine, our Head of Operations. We've got a jam-packed session planned for you today. We'll start off by establishing why it is we're running this webinar, discussing the value of research for content and thought leadership, before we identify some of the challenges that you as PR and marketing professionals might face when looking to leverage this value. So that this webinar is a good use of your time this afternoon, our aim is to address each of these challenges and share with you some practical tips, tricks, and advice on how you can overcome them. And we're going to be sharing some real examples from studies that we've run with our clients to really put this into practice and bring it to life for you. Of course, we appreciate that you may not have the time or resources to overcome these challenges alone, so we will share how we might be able to help you in this space before we wrap up with a Q&A. We'd love to hear from you in the Q&A, so please do share your thoughts with us. You can do this throughout the presentation. Just post your questions into the Q&A function. This can be public or anonymous, and then we'll address them at the end. Great. So let's get started. First of all, why have we invited you here today to attend this webinar? Why are we discussing this topic? Well, we value research. Of course we do. We're a research business, and doing research is what we love. It's why we exist. But we also know that research and the data that it can generate can be hugely valuable for content and thought leadership purposes. We work with a number of PR and marketing professionals who, like us, see the value in conducting research so that they can create extraordinary content, headlines, and stories backed up by robust data and insight. But why is it important for content to be backed up by data? Well, we find that conducting research for content and thought leadership can unlock three key benefits. Firstly, it generates evidence that you can use to back up a story, back up a headline, and in doing so, it creates credibility. And this credibility can extend beyond the content. It can help to reinforce the trustworthiness and reputation of agencies and brands that are using this evidence. Secondly, doing research, you can demonstrate a superior understanding of your market. This creates exclusivity. In demonstrating that superior understanding of your market, of your audience, or a product, you're in a position whereby you can put forward different and unique narratives that your competitors can't. And finally, research data can often be used to help drive engagement. It can help explain complex topics and bring them to life in meaningful ways. And in doing this, you can ensure that your content has greater engagement, has greater resonance, and it further justifies the headlines that you're putting forward. And as a result, it's more likely to be picked up in press. Unlocking these benefits supports PR and marketing professionals because it helps you to achieve three strategic goals, which a lot of our clients often come to us with. They want to be able to boost their content strategies. They want to become or reinforce their credibility, expertise, and position themselves as a thought leader. And they're looking to create new opportunities, be that for sales or for PR purposes. I'm sure you can all agree, doesn't this sound brilliant? And why aren't we all conducting research for content and thought leadership purposes? Well, if we put time and investment aside, we do know that it isn't always easy. There are challenges that we can face when we look to apply the data and the insight that we generate from research and how we create compelling narratives and stories using that evidence. I'm now going to hand over to Catherine, who's going to share some of these challenges with you, and then we'll demonstrate how they can be overcome.
Now, here are some real-life examples of challenges that some of our clients have faced, anonymized, of course. You'll have to let me know if they sound familiar. Firstly, we've spent a lot of time digging through the data and we're struggling to come up with any media-worthy storylines. We're concerned the data feels a little flat. Can you help us get more out of the data? 2, these are not the results we're expecting. Are you able to help us validate the research findings? 3, we've got an event coming up. Is there any way to repurpose and reuse some of the research that we conducted with you earlier on in the year? And 4, how do we know this research is providing a true reflection of our market and audience? If these do sound familiar, or you've shared this experience, you're certainly not alone. Ultimately, what we see these boil down to is how do I or we make the most out of the research with the time and budget that we've got? And for us, this is where striving to create narrative-led content comes in. In this next section, we're going to explore some of the challenges I mentioned earlier and share our approach to tackling these, including our tips and tricks and some real-life case studies. As I've mentioned, our primary challenge here is to help you maximize value from research, to ensure that you get the return on investment from time and budget that you've invested. But what does this look like in reality? Well, we're going to break this down into 3 key areas. The first is all around maximizing utility and impact. The second is around data credibility and depth. And third, data for longevity. I'll now hand over back to Harriet, who will unpack the first of these 3 areas.
Thanks so much, Catherine. So let's take this first area, maximising utility and impact. From our work in this space and speaking to our clients, we know how important it is that the data and insight we generate from research is relevant. It has to tie into the objectives that it's been directly designed to address, and it needs to be valuable for decision making. We also know how important it is that the data we generate is actionable. It's imperative that we can derive clear, actionable insights from the data and create compelling narratives that our audiences are going to engage with. And finally, the best use of research data is when it can create a competitive edge. I mentioned earlier how doing research for content and thought leadership purposes can create unique stories and points of view. These are points of difference, and you can use this data in a proprietary and exclusive way to generate the engagement and impact with your content. So how can we ensure that research ticks all of these boxes and it doesn't fall flat in face of this first hurdle, maximising utility and impact? Well, we do have some tips and tricks to share with you, but before we do, Catherine's got a real example from one of our recent studies which addressed this challenge head on.
Thanks, Harriet. So let's start with a real life challenge we've faced. Now, our client was preparing for an up and coming event and wanted to use research to build a compelling narrative. Their goal? To provide concrete evidence supporting the use of pricing consultancies alongside supporting software and tools. Now, during our initial research design, we had crafted specific questions that we believed would help us build a model to support this narrative. However, when we reached the analysis phase, we hit a bit of a roadblock. We couldn't find the causal link we were looking for to support our initial hypothesis. And this is where things get interesting. We were working with a really tight deadline due to an up-and-coming event, so conducting a new study or going back into field just wasn't an option. We had to think on our feet. Instead, what we decided to do was comb back through the existing data, taking each question in turn, and try to look at it from a different angle. Instead of trying to force a narrative that wasn't there, we flipped our approach. And this shift in perspective led to some really interesting outcomes. Not only did we find a new angle for our client's narrative, but we also uncovered additional content that could be distributed alongside the original white paper report that we were creating. Now, let me just walk you through an example of how this worked. So initially for this client, we were looking for a single causal link to answer a key question, which was, are those who are using pricing software and external help doing better than average? But when we changed our lens and reevaluated what better than average really means, this actually gave us some better insights. Rather than looking at whether pricing strategy users were performing better, we flipped this and instead looked from the top down at those who we had identified are industry leaders and what they were doing. And what we found was that industry leaders were much more likely to have successful pricing strategies, and 7 in 10 of those used external support. Ultimately, this narrative still meets the client's objectives. It's just the angle and how we got there was slightly different than we'd anticipated. And for me, I personally take away 2 key things from this challenge. Firstly, adaptability is crucial. When your initial research doesn't yield the expected results, be prepared to shift your perspective. And secondly, look out for hidden narratives. Sometimes the most compelling stories in your data aren't necessarily the ones that you initially set out to find.
Brilliant. Thanks for sharing that example, Catherine. I'm sure you'll agree with me that that's a really great use of flipping the script to get maximum utility and impact. So in addition to the example that Catherine just talked us through, what are some of the other pieces of advice that we'd give in this space? Well, firstly, don't underestimate the power of open-ended questions. Even when you're doing an online quantitative survey, there's still opportunity to generate depth of insight by asking questions that require a written response. For thought leadership reports, these questions can help to explain the why behind some of the data and also provide some critical context that when you align it with the business objective can demonstrate real expertise. For smaller content pieces like press articles, we can also code up that data from the open-ended questions and turn it into statistical data, which you can then use in your headlines as evidence. Secondly, framing the data in real-world terms is a great way to ensure relevance. Statistics alone can lack meaning, but if you can calculate the real-life impact, your story can be much more compelling. For example, take a statistic which says that 61% of 14 to 18-year-olds don't feel encouraged by their teachers to become business owners in the future. Okay, it's a pretty decent narrative already, but what if I told you that this represents 2.3 million young people and potential business leaders of the future? This is more than the entire population of Latvia. We've gone from a mere statistic of 61% to a much bigger and much more compelling narrative and headline that you can use. Thirdly, flipping the script. Catherine's just demonstrated a brilliant example of this, and it's a really useful technique that you can use when the data doesn't seem to quite align with the headline that you were looking to generate. And finally, finding the nuance in comparisons. It can sometimes be helpful to look at comparing subgroups within your sample to add an extra layer of relevance and also applicability of your data. You may find some interesting new headlines when you take that time to dig deeper and look for further meaning. Now let's move on to our second area, data credibility and depth. This is such an important consideration for PR and marketing professionals. You need to be confident that the data you are citing will stand up to scrutiny when it is published. To do this, we need to ensure that the data is comprehensive. It's providing a holistic view of the market, of the audience, or the product in question. When it comes to credibility, how the data is analysed is also key. It's a no-brainer for us as researchers, but we want to ensure that you have full confidence in how the data is being analysed, and most importantly, that the interpretations you're taking from it are sound. And finally, the data has to be accurate and reliable. If there are any biases or limitations in the sample, we need to address them. And we also need to explain if there's any contradictions in the data. I'll hand back over to Catherine now, who will share another example of how these questions were tackled by one of our clients before sharing some tips and tricks.
Earlier, Harriet talked about the use of open-ends. Now let's see it in practice and look at a different challenge a global IT software provider faced earlier this year. During fieldwork, initial data output revealed some surprisingly high results that didn't quite align with external sources. And for us, this raised some concerns and prompted us to take a closer look. We were confident in our screening criteria, so we knew that we needed to dig deeper to understand what was causing this potential discrepancy. And we came up with 2 solutions that did require a mid-fieldwork adjustment. Firstly, we decided to include an additional open-ended question, which was designed to give us a better understanding of how our target audience was interpreting this question. And secondly, the question I'm referring to had initially been set up as a binary choice, therefore a yes or no answer option, which we realized might actually be oversimplifying a perhaps more complex situation. So we tweaked the options to provide some more nuance. Now, this flexible approach resulted in 2 positive outcomes for us. The first one being quality assurance. The additional information gained from the open-ended question provided reassurance for both ourselves and for our client that the quality of respondents could be trusted and we were speaking to the right respondents. And secondly, the answers to the open-ended question gave us 3 or 4 additional pieces of information that not only provided us with great context, but it was also information that we could use to add colour and strengthen our narrative. What this is a reminder of is being prepared to adapt. So as a smaller research agency, we do have the luxury to be flexible in the way that we work with our clients. Secondly, that context is absolutely crucial. And open-ended questions can provide that valuable context that helps us interpret quantitative data accurately. And then finally, sometimes unexpected results can lead to richer insights. Had we not had this challenge in the first place, we wouldn't have made the change and captured the extra insight that we did.
Brilliant, thanks, Catherine. So in addition to the example that Catherine just shared with us there are lots of ways that you can convey data credibility and depth when applying the research findings to your content. First, an easy one, showing how you got the data will help to drive trust in it. It's best practice, but we always recommend showcasing who you spoke to, how you spoke to them, and how you process the data somewhere in your report, in your press release, so that you can easily answer any questions that might arise related to this. Secondly, clients sometimes come to us and suggest that the data that's been collected isn't as exciting as they thought it might be. It might appear flat or may lack headline statistics, standouts that they were looking for. As Catherine demonstrated in the earlier example, this isn't always a bad thing. Flat data can often have hidden meanings with more to the story than meets the eye. And this actually gives you a more nuanced narrative and story that you can tell. Thirdly, sometimes you'll find contradictions in the data. Your initial reaction might be to check the quality of the data, as these contradictions might create unwanted complexity, or they might add potential confusion to the narrative you're deploying. But as with flat data, this doesn't have to be the case. We always recommend dig deeper. Let's find the root cause of the contention and then maximize what we find. Often you'll uncover a hidden gem in the data that gives your story much more depth. And now let's address statistical significance. Being able to back up your headlines with significance testing can be a real support. It can add serious weight to your argument. Take an example from a recent study where we found that a significantly higher number of users of a particular automation product spent less time on manual tasks in their jobs and had higher satisfaction. This is a really strong and compelling narrative. But what if that difference hadn't been statistically significantly different? In this instance, the benefits of this product are still very clear. there is less manual work, and there is higher satisfaction. And despite the difference lacking statistical weight, the narrative still holds true. Before we move on to our final area, I just wanted to have a quick reminder for you all. If you do have any questions, please pop them into the Q&A function. We'd love to see your thoughts, and we'll come to them at the end of the session. Brilliant. So now to our final area, data for longevity. In an ideal world, we would conduct bespoke research for individual content campaigns to ensure that you can generate bespoke statistics and narratives every time. But we know that that isn't the reality, and it's not always possible to do this. So what we do is we encourage our clients to think about how they can generate longevity in the research that they do. When conducting research for content purposes, we recommend considering how to scale up the research so that you can create multiple use cases for it. And secondly, we also suggest asking questions that can be benchmarked and compared to wider trends to allow for comparability. In doing both of these things, we can look to build narratives that can be used in different ways, and the value from doing this type of research can increase over time. Over to Catherine now, who has a great example of this to share.
So for our final case study, we have a client whose challenge was all around bringing a fresh perspective to an already saturated content space. And in today's fast-paced digital world, creating unique, attention-grabbing content is becoming more and more difficult. Our client needed something that would stand out and provide long-term value, plus budget was limited. So how did we address this challenge? Well, first of all, we merged our primary data with secondary research to create a unique calculation which was specific to the client's environment. And this resulted in us having information that no one else had access to, giving us a competitive edge when it came to trade media. Plus, sometimes supplementing with secondary research can bolster findings without significantly adding cost. Secondly, we reviewed previous research that we conducted with this client to identify questions that potentially we could rework and track over time moving forward. And this allowed us to build on existing knowledge while also providing fresh insights. Of course, a part of the success of this approach was down to finding the white space. So we had reviewed sector-specific trade to create new questions based on information that we felt was missing from current trade media. And by addressing the gaps, we aim to provide insight that wasn't already available anywhere else. What this meant was that we ultimately created a piece of research that wasn't a one-off study, but it was the beginning of a longitudinal research project that's now going into its 5th year in commission. And our study has become one of the only ones tracking this specific data point for the last 4 years. And this type of exclusivity has provided our client with significant competitive advantage when it comes to the content marketing efforts.
Great. In order to ensure long-term value, we do have a few final tips and tricks to share with you. Some of these relate to the design of the research, whereas others look at how you can apply the data that you generate. So let's take design first. Our first tip is to maximize your sample size. And if you can, why not go global? Larger international samples give you much more room to play with the data, and you can create different angles on which you can hang your headlines. We do know that including multiple markets in your research can incur additional cost, but we think that the added value this can bring to your study could be much greater than the cost you actually invest. As Catherine highlighted in her example, designing research that can be tracked over time is also a simple way to ensure longevity, as does looking at how your data aligns to broader trends and narratives within your market or your sector. And finally, a powerful narrative to use in thought leadership is being able to demonstrate which trends are here to stay and which are fads. In doing this, you can make meaningful predictions for the future, backed by robust evidence and a compelling point of view. That's a lot of information that Catherine and I have just shared with you. So I'm going to hand over to Catherine now, who'll sum up before sharing ways that we might be able to help you in the future.
So what are the key takeaways for today? Well, firstly, around maximising impact and utility. Analysis is not always linear, and there's definitely not one way to just look at the data. Don't be afraid of using open ends, including secondary data sources, and challenging your initial hypotheses. Secondly, around data credibility and depth. Give the data a second chance. If the quality is clear, then it can definitely be utilised. Forget preconceptions and find context. And don't forget, statistical significance isn't always everything. And finally, when it comes to data for longevity, old data can in fact be new data if trackability is there. You just need to design with this in mind. And as a fail-safe, I always like to include 1 or 2 questions around audience sentiment that can be tracked over time. And sometimes, as Harriet has just pointed out, bigger is better. Investing more now in a slightly expanded sample could give you a greater return in the long run. In such a short amount of time, it would obviously be impossible for us to cover all aspects when it comes to creating narrative-led content, but hopefully there'll be a few things that you'll be able to take away from this webinar and apply it to your own research projects. Now, aside from webinars, we do actually offer longer bespoke training sessions, and these can either take place in our dedicated Sapio school, which you can see here on the screen in London Bridge, or we can come to you. At the moment, the type of sessions that we offer, they're around survey design, data processing analysis, and insight and headlines generation. And if you're interested in any of these, you can scan the QR code on the screen or email us at team@sapioresearch.com. And just before we close this webinar for questions, I am going to hand over to one of our co-founders and CEO, Andrew, who has been working on the creation of our first proprietary platform to support in creating narrative-led content.
Thank you. And a big thank you to Catherine and Harriet today for sharing their expertise. And thanks everyone for joining us for this session. As Catherine mentioned, we'll be running a Q&A session very shortly. So feel free to keep submitting your questions into the Q&A function. Now at Sapio Research, our purpose is simple: to provide data confidence for all. We're passionate about helping individuals like you harness and understand data more effectively. It's what gets us up in the morning, and it's why our company exists. We hope that sharing knowledge, like we've done today, goes some way to achieve this purpose.